Had a very beautiful community. Tulsi Gabbard has come out with her latest conspiratorial contribution, and rather than sort of laughing at her, I want to analyze it deeply, including analyzing what's wrong even behind the text that she speaks. So let's rock and roll.
But what I've seen over these months is that every time they make progress and they move closer and closer to that hope for peace,
every time they move closer and closer to that hope for peace is a misdescription of what certainly Trump himself thinks about the Russia-Ukrainian war, because Trump doesn't understand its causes. He partly thinks it's a territorial war, partly thinks it's a national security war, and partly thinks it's an expression of Vladimir Putin's personality, which can actually be modified by an appropriate interaction of Trump's personality with Putin's personality, which then could generate a kind of turnabout on Putin's part.
Warmongers in the deep state step up and try to do everything they can to stop them. Predictably, they use the same old tactics.
The warmongers and the deep state try to do everything they can to stop them. So a question arises, who's Tulsi talking about? And the question arises, what kind of powers and influence do they have? And is it a they that's actual people, or is it some kind of institutional systemic tendency? And the next question that arises is, why is the Director of National Intelligence speaking about institutions as though she were a YouTube commentator outsider, rather than actually somebody who represents them? It's a certain kind of political crime to present institutions as opaque. It's doubly a crime to present institutions as opaque while you yourself are a member of them, because that absolves you of the responsibility to be accountable to facts, truth, and reality. But let's broaden out a bit and take this slowly. If you try to break down the term the deep state, it might dissolve. It might not stand up that well to reflection. However, if we were to be extremely generous to Tulsi Gabbard and say, we're going to give her as much credit as we possibly can about this claim she is making, even though it's vague, how much credit could we actually give her? Well, I think we could certainly make the point that it is one interest of the United States, among others, to bring it about that the world is a more dangerous place. We don't need to define or even find a particular degree of coherence in claims about the deep state or about the military-industrial complex, but we can certainly say that it is a systematic causal component, right? It's a component of the economy of causation of US foreign policy to bring it about that the world's a more dangerous place. But here's the problem with this. It leaves out what all the other motivations are, what all the other elements of the causal economy of US foreign policy are, and how we weigh them. To take another example, it is certainly a causal pressure on me when I communicate with you here and on the main channel to tell you things that aren't true. There's a lot of causal pressure on me to tell you that Russia is collapsing more than it is, or that Ukraine is stronger than it is, or that Trump is weaker than he is, in the sense that his mode of politics is going to be replaced by a reversion to what we had before, a kind of centrist technocracy. I am strongly incentivized to normalize the centrist technocracy that preceded Trump and not blame it for Trump's rise. but it doesn't follow that I'm going to do that. It's just one causal pressure among others. But you certainly can't explain my actions by that, simply because, in fact, I completely disregard that pressure. Because it would be a disaster to get 10 times more views with that kind of messaging, which would be very popular and well received. So from the fact that something is part of a causal economy, it absolutely doesn't follow that it is the cause of anything at all. You need to have a look in each particular case. Now, if you thought that in the particular case of Ukraine, the central cause of the West's involvement is some kind of pressure from the deep state or the military-industrial complex, you'd be dreaming. That's just not a plausible explanation of our extravagantly reluctant involvement at all. And so we can give credit of that kind to Tulsi, but this kind of credit only allows you to say that this is one element of the causal picture among others, that there are many other elements, and that which elements outweigh which other elements is always a practical question for contingent judgment. And therefore, sellotaping the military-industrial complex, sellotaping the deep state onto particular cases is a form of conspiracy thinking. So that's the first bit of sort of epistemic scaffolding we need. Well, let's listen on.
Tactics that they've always used, the deep state within the intelligence community weaponizes intelligence to try to undermine progress. They leak it to their...
More deep state stuff. So the psychology, and we've talked about this a couple of times before, the psychology of a conspiratorial approach isn't that there are some things we need to know which we don't know yet. It's rather that it's simply the case that the stuff that really matters is the stuff that can't be seen. So there's an element of magical thinking structured into conspiratorial thought. And Tulsi is exploiting that for her entrepreneurial benefit. And it's a double political crime, because she's doing it not as an outside commentator, but as a representative of these institutions, which further harms, frankly, all institutions, and further exonerates her inappropriately from any kind of accountability, because the causes of all the bad things are these mysterious currents of the deep state. There is also something else here, and that's that there's a kind of blend of entrepreneurialism surfing the public mood and social media algorithms for self-advancement. There's a combination of that and a sort of eerie, uncanny, and strange sincerity. I don't want to overly legislate Tulsi's early life here, except to say that having observed Tulsi for many, many years, including when she was firmly on the center-left, it's always seemed to me, even when the people who now despise her were fans of her, that she had a propensity for a slightly unhealthy, premature certainty about things. That almost had a sort of an element of rigidity and darkness to it. Let's listen on.
Friends in the mainstream propaganda media to try to spread this and push a false narrative. They foment fear and hysteria as a way to justify the continuing of the war and their efforts to undermine President Trump's efforts towards peace, and do so specifically in this case in order to try to pull the U.S. military into a direct conflict with Russia, which is ultimately what the EU and NATO want. We cannot allow this.
So, a bit of more granular political analysis here. The EU and NATO are spoken about in a strange way here by Tulsi. EU, understandably, the United States is not a member of the European Union, but the United States is the leading member of NATO. Notice the normalization of this in Tulsi's speech and in Trump's speech, which is to go on as though you're not actually a member of NATO at all. Trump speaks as though NATO were a foreign alliance. Tulsi speaks as though NATO were a foreign alliance. Now, another bit of political analysis. It's certainly been the position of Ukraine to try to implicate the United States in the war as far as possible. And from the Ukrainian point of view, from the point of view of at least the Ukrainian government, it would be permissible to run significant risks of direct Russo-US confrontation if there were some way of pulling the United States into the war. But that is certainly not what NATO wants to do, and is certainly not what the European Union wants to do. The European Union is terrified of the prospect of any direct confrontation between Western forces and Russian forces. So this isn't just not true, but there is actually a systematic aversion and a deep anxiety in every major Western country about the prospect of something happening, which Tulsi is falsely claiming Western major powers are trying to make happen. Now let's read this tweet from Tulsi. Deep state warmongers and their propaganda media are again trying to undermine Trump's efforts for peace by falsely claiming that the US intelligence community agrees to and supports the EU-NATO viewpoint that Russia's aim is to invade, conquer Europe. The truth is that, quote-unquote, US intelligence assesses that Russia does not even have the capability to conquer and occupy Ukraine. So it's important that this is a tissue of confusion between three distinct claims. Number one, does Russia have the capacity for territorial acquisition of the entirety of Ukraine? Two, does Russia have a desire for territorial acquisition of all of Ukraine? Three, does Russia have the desire, the aspiration to attain political control over all of Ukraine? And it's the third element that we should focus on, because that does remain a Kremlin aspiration. Full control over Ukraine remains a Kremlin aspiration. Full territorial control of Ukraine is not a Kremlin aspiration. Capacity for full territorial control over Ukraine is not possessed by the Kremlin, and the Kremlin knows that. So, there are not just falsehoods and conflations in such a short tweet and such a short speech. There are also sort of deep currents of profound and toxic epistemic corruption of citizens who Tulsi represents, capacity to make sense of their politics. This woman is an opacity merchant, and opacity is the enemy of democracy. Lots of love. Talk soon.
time they make progress and they move closer and closer to that hope for peace, the warmongers in the deep state step up and try to do everything they can to stop them. Predictably, they use the same old tactics that they've always used. The deep state within the intelligence community weaponizes intelligence to try to undermine progress. They leak it to their friends.